Hi everybody, I'm Pat. I think probably most of you know me. I work here with Roscoe and Alexa in TREC. TREC is an initiative of the Niagara Global Tourism Institute. The Niagara Global Tourism Institute does 4 things. Besides run TREC, we do 3 other things. One of them is we do research. That's where Kurt comes in. He does research for us or heads it up, and we get other researchers from Niagara University to help. We have a workforce pillar. We do training of front desk clerks and at high people that have been chronically unemployed. Roscoe is really an expert in workforce stuff. And we have a technology pillar. We've installed Wi-Fi in downtown Niagara Falls. People used to come here and turn their phones off because they didn't want to pay international roaming charges. And who wants to do that, right? If you go someplace today, you want to have Wi-Fi. So, TREC is, this building is called TREC, and as we were just talking about this today, it's become, we have a branding problem. Everybody knows TREC. Not too many people know the Niagara Global Tourism Institute, but we run TREC. It's the other way around now. We have a bigger brand with TREC than we do with our own organization. And I think that's because it's a physical place. People could see it and drive by it and come and visit us. And TREC is really devoted to entrepreneurs. We help people start businesses, specifically people that have an idea for a business. We help them get it out of their head on a piece of paper so they can launch a business. Or if they've already started a business, help them move that business along. And we're really trying hard to get people in Niagara Falls to start businesses. So if you're hanging around Niagara Falls and run to somebody that's got an idea, or their next door neighbor has an idea, or their niece has an idea, we love them in TREC. If they can't afford a $100 a month fee to be a member of TREC, we're happy to give them 3 months free. And we'll analyze how they're doing after 3 months. So, and Alan's here. One of our frequent attendees. We run a lot of different programs in here. One of them is Niagara Open Coffee Club. If anybody wants to do networking on a Monday morning at 8:30, Alan's always going to be here. And we have lots of programs. So every 3rd Wednesday of the month, we have this guide talk. Next month, we'll have Kim Marie Kernan talking about creating your own brand. So tonight's information might be interesting for you to actually think about how you would film yourself and make that brand, and that's going to talk about that. But next month, we'll have Kim Marie Kernan talk about the content that you might want to have filmed. So that might be of great interest to a lot of people here. So we're part of Niagara University, and another organization that's part of Niagara University is where Ed works, and you're going to hear more from Ed in a minute. But it's the Castellani Art Museum, and Ellen Owen is the director of the Castellani Art Museum, and she's relatively new to Western New York, came from Philadelphia. And it's been a breath of fresh air to have Ellen as part of the Niagara University community, because she is reaching out to the community, and that's why she's here tonight, and Ed's here tonight. So it was her idea, actually, to have Ed. It's a great idea. And she's going to talk a little bit about the Castellani and introduce Ed.
Great.
Thanks, Ellen.
Thank you, Pat. Hi, everybody. Thank you. I'm glad you responded. I am new to the area, both new to your weather and also new to what is happening in Western New York. I'm very excited to be part of your community. And the Castellani has an amazing collection of art. If you haven't been there, it's world-class art. Institutions in New York City actually borrow our art because many of the pieces are so extraordinary. So I wanted to cordially invite you to come and see the Castellani. It is open and free on the weekends right now, and we'll have expanded hours moving into the summer months starting in June. But we have some incredible shows coming up. Ed is curating a show of Turkish Ebru painting, which is a really traditional technique. We'll be opening up this spring. There is a really amazing show by this contemporary woman artist who is kind of a spearhead for women and people that were marginalized in the art world in New York City in the 80s and 90s. Her name is Dorothy Gillespie. We're borrowing that work from another university museum. So very excited. The crates came today. It's unlike anything you've ever seen. So I came here in November. I'd be, as Pat said, delighted to work with more people in the community and think about what your needs are and how we might be able to fulfill them with programs and exhibits. So I have an open door policy. If anybody wants to talk to me, I'm really open to that, and I'd love to be introduced to people, so feel free to come say hi. Ed is an amazing colleague. He has been at the Castellani Art Museum for 6 years. He is a real expert in folklore, and that is his profession. He's a folklorist. And Ed is also an amazing professor at NU. So he serves dual roles, but he curates shows at the museum, and that's unlike anywhere in Western New York. There is no other place that interprets folk history in the same way that the Castellani does. So Ed has a background in anthropology, his undergrad, and his master's is in folklore, and he has done a lot of work to prepare for this today. And this is a different kind of audience for him. He's really excited to present to you. So it's really my pleasure to introduce Ed, and I hope to talk to you afterwards. So nice to meet you.
Thanks, Ellen. All right, thanks, Ellen, for the introduction. As Ellen mentioned, my name is Edward Millar. I'm curator of folk arts at the Castellani Art Museum. So we'll start just with a kind of general background on myself. As Ellen mentioned, I've been working there for about 6 years, but the actual folk arts program at the museum has been there for about 30 years. So we're primarily funded through the New York State Council on the Arts. It's kind of our big push. And there's basically 4 pillars to the work that I do as a folklorist and what the folk arts program does at the museum. Field work, exhibitions, programs, and initiatives. So the basic foundation of my work is what's called field work, right? So I'm going out and I am interviewing, doing photographs, doing videography, doing all of these things with people who have some kind of special cultural knowledge, right? But what's unique about folk arts programs and how they're set up in New York State and across the United States is we're all focused very regionally and local, right? So as Ellen mentioned, we have an upcoming exhibit of Turkish paper marbling, right? But we're not working with a artist, who's living in Turkey to do it. It's someone who's local, who came from Turkey but brought this tradition with them, and they know how to do that still. So part of our focus and our attention is always on what's specifically within this Buffalo Niagara region and Western New York. So I'm going out and I'm doing, again, audio interviews, we're doing photography, we're doing videography. Unfortunately, this is, because I'm often behind the camera, this is literally the only picture of me, is me fixing my sleeves, interviewing a group of wood carvers in North Tonawanda. Exhibitions is one of the big things that we're involved in, so we do curate these shows that help to raise awareness of the different kinds of traditional art that is present in the Western New York area. We organize programs that provide people who have a special knowledge. So this is like Harice, who is the Ebru artist that's being featured in the upcoming exhibit. Leading a workshop at the Castellani to teach people and talk about the meanings behind traditional paper marbling and how it's done. It's pretty cool. It's very much like alchemy because you're literally painting water and the paint doesn't sink through. One of the other big things we're involved in are also initiatives. So these initiatives I always call things that don't kind of fit easily into an exhibition or kind of program type of thing. So from this picture, does anyone recognize where that might be? Anyone local?
Lancaster Speedway?
Almost Lancaster Speedway. So John Nelson is from Lancaster and is actually a race director at Lancaster Speedway as well. But this is actually the Ransomville Speedway.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but there's a lot of overlap between the two. So in 2020, we actually got a fellowship from the Library of Congress to interview people who work and race at the Ransomville Speedway. And all of those materials then end up becoming an official collection at the Library of Congress, right? Kind of documenting, raising awareness about dirt track culture and all that goes into it, right? So these are really kind of the 4 pillars of our work. And to kind of transition into what the talk today is going to be focused on, it's going to be focused on the idea of storytelling. So how does storytelling, why is it important for startups? And then what kind of tools do you need to start content creation, right? So that today, this telling your story, content creation, the content creation we're talking about today, the content is the story, right? That's what we're going to be looking at today and kind of talking through. And then finally, the presentations, I think this has a laser on it. Maybe it does. Is how do you curate and present your story? That's going to be one of the other things we're going to focus on. So what we'll get started with is just an example, just so we can all go on the same page.
Nestled in between the Skincare Love Beauty Spa and Avani's Pest Control School here in Elmhurst, Queens, is Indo Java, a 2-aisle mini mart for all things Indonesian. But every Tuesday, it turns into the city's smallest restaurant with truly authentic Indonesian food.
Hi, welcome to Warren Plaza.
You're in luck. You got the best table in the house.
So what? And what's this?
It's also the only table.
My name is Devi Chayati. I'm the owner of the Indo Java. We opened Indo Java 10 years ago. Every Tuesday, I put right here for all the customers. We call Warung Selasa, so it means Tuesday food stall.
This little soubrette turned one-table pop-up restaurant isn't complete without one of the smallest kitchens in the world.
Our kitchen is very tiny. It's a love kitchen because just enough for 2 persons.
2 people might be a stretch. It's half the size of a broom closet, but it doesn't stop Dewi from whipping up classic Indonesian fare like gudeg and rendang ayam.
Just like the original.
Yummy. Before, there is non-Indonesian store. It's difficult to find the ingredient from Indonesia and we miss the community. If we have a store, the Indonesian people will come here and then we still can talk Indonesian language. That's our dream, and then now it's happening. I'm not a professional chef. I don't have any education chef background, so I just learned from my mom. In the restaurant, the chef always hide in the kitchen. I like to talk with the customer when I serve the food, so we can share the story. They always say next week I have to come again.
We're just going to let us exit out of there.
How'd you come across that?
Prep your home for spring with
No,
the
hold
home
on.
sale. Get 25%
We don't need any
off bedding.
commercials.
Bath towels for just
The,
$9.99.
So Great Big Story we're going to talk about kind of towards the end of it and some of the other resources like that. But I came across it and I specifically selected that clip because it's Indonesia and my half of my family is from Malaysia, so it's kind of similar culture. So like some of the dishes I kind of do.
Who's sharing it with you?
Was it?
Did somebody share that with you?
No, I had found this is a great channel, yeah. Great Big Story. It's a great channel. So, what were some of the things you guys learned just listening to this story and listening to Debbie kind of talk? Maybe 3 things that stood out. Passion for cooking, right? So passion's one.
The fact that she's not a professional chef.
Not a professional chef, so still kind of on that passion area, right?
The whole history of the business.
History of the business, right? So that was, and what else?
And sharing her culture was important to her and the community.
With the community, right? So community is the big thing too, right? So she mentioned that there wasn't any like Indonesian kind of small grocery store, and those kind of specialty grocery stores are critical for a lot of communities, and so a lot of it was also focused on community engagement, right? So that clip that they had of her talking about how she doesn't like to hide in the kitchen, right? She likes to engage with people when they come in and eat, right? And the idea that it's a small kitchen, right? That was kind of like the big idea behind it, and we're going to talk about big ideas later on. But I think that's an example of how even a short form video like that, which is becoming very popular, especially if anyone browses YouTube, just the amount of information that you can get across in like a 2-minute period, right? In like a very short period. And a lot of that is thanks to storytelling, right? The idea that when we tell stories, we're not just, talking at someone, but, they're kind of with us as, they're standing with us as we're telling their story, right? That we're sharing like specific kind of cultural knowledge through a specific example, right? So she's talking about how there wasn't any Indonesian store before, right? So that's, when you hear that, you're having this touch point, you're like, oh, there's this lack in the community. And then, this is how this business now is kind of fulfilling that community need. So that's what we're really going to focus on today, is this connection between storytelling and content creation. And it sounds like the next guide talk is going to, kind of segue really nicely into that, with that idea about, okay, what specifically, with branding, or, what are you going to look at with branding? The strictest definition of storytelling, presented by the National Storytelling Network, is that storytelling is the interactive art of using words, vocalizations, and/or physical movement and gesture to reveal the elements and images of a story to specific live audiences, right? So that's a very kind of academic kind of turn to it. So I like to really kind of break down storytelling more as this idea of that sharing of knowledge and that exchange of knowledge between two or more people, right? Storytelling doesn't exist in a vacuum. There has to be someone that you're telling the story to, Sometimes that can be yourself, I guess, if you're kind of you're recounting a story out loud to yourself. But storytelling, it is something that emerges from conversations with one another. And storytelling is really important because it is what turns a space, or kind of a space, into a place. So even if you, let's say you had visited New York City, you've gone to this Indo-Java store, you would have interacted with it as a space, right? Because you wouldn't have known like all of the kind of contextual information, all that kind of stuff that comes from hearing the story. So like hearing how the business started, what kind of lack was it looking to fulfill. And one of the other things, if you notice through it, and what we're going to focus on later on too, is the idea of visual storytelling. And this is where kind of again moves a bit farther away from that more academic definition of storytelling into the idea that we can tell stories just through still imagery, right? Through candid, kind of curated shots of anything. How many of you guys have ever seen like kind of food marketing or that kind of stuff, right? You see like really nice like burger or whatever, right? The idea that just looking at it, it tells a particular story. So the whole idea of visual storytelling is that we can communicate certain messages, certain emotions, certain meanings through still image or through moving image as well. And one of the other things that's great about storytelling, is where do we find it? Where have you guys heard stories before? Movies, right? Grandparents, right? PBS, yeah, PBS too. What about like friends? You hang out with your friends, you guys are exchanging stories like, oh, you won't believe what I was up to last night, with your parents, maybe like leaving out certain details, that kind of stuff. Having your parents tell stories, so that we encounter stories throughout all aspects of our life, right? And that's what makes the storytelling, even though it's kind of, maybe kind of shifted away from that idea of like the old folk tales and fairy tales that we kind of traditionally associate with storytelling, that it's still very much a rich tradition that we all engage in, right? And it's through that tradition, which is that very intimate thing that kind of connects all of us, that you're able to really create these really strong kind of touch points with prospective audiences, right? And so one of the questions, is why is it important? What does it do for us as individuals? And there's an example that I told some of these students already earlier on, so they're going to hear this story again. But there's a story I love telling my students that very much displays this point. And it involves, a teenager growing up in New Jersey doing teenager things. How many of you guys have heard of stickball? Right, so stickball, you got a stick and you got a ball, right? So it's a very, very complicated sport. But I was hanging out at my friend Alex's house. Alex lived in Carlstadt, and he had a big tree in his front yard. And, I was hanging out on the lawn, and then Alex was inside searching for a ball and stuff, and our other friend Bear, who got his nickname because he broke a kid's neck, by falling off a slide onto him. The other kid was okay, so they had a happy ending with that. But he was up in the tree, right? So irony, bear, climbing up in the tree, and he's got the stickball bat in his hand. And my friend Alex comes out of the house, and he's got a ball in his hand. So how many of you guys know stickball, but how many of you have played it? Right, so how do you get someone out in stickball?
Well, stickball is kind of like a two-base baseball game.
Yeah, it can be. Yeah, if you think like with bases, I don't know if maybe the rules might be a little different, but we played with pegging rules, right? So you would get someone out if you.
From New Jersey.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. So you would get them out basically in stickball by throwing the ball as hard as you can and trying to hit them, right? So my friend Alex sees Bear up in the tree. First thing that comes to his mind is, hey, I'm gonna peg him in the face, and so he does, right? And obviously Bear, had some anger stuff going on. And he, jumps up, he's got the bat in his hand, and he turns around and just wham, as hard as he can at the nearest thing, which happened to be my back, right? And so I still got a dent in my back, kind of like this permanent kind of reminder of this situation. But so sharing stories like that is important because even though this is something that happened like 14 years ago, when I share it, I still feel those same emotions of nostalgia, right? And I can still picture that house. I haven't lived in New Jersey for a very long time, and I can still, I know what the outside of that house looks like, right? So storytelling, for an individual, when you hear a story, it provides this kind of connection. It provides, this expression of emotion, and, and sharing it with all of you, you guys have now experienced those same emotions with me, right? You've hit on those same feelings of nostalgia, of, kind of teenage miscreants. Maybe you're thinking about, hey, when I was a kid, I did something similar to that, right? So storytelling, it basically is really what connects us to one another. And that's where it really kind of transitions into for startups and businesses, right? It's the idea that storytelling, because it is this very primal, very kind of foundational way of connecting individuals to one another, that when you're working with something and you're passionate about it, that you can use these kinds of stories to connect with prospective audiences, right? That you can really, kind of turn that idea and kind of that amorphous thing into an action, into the act of actually telling it, kind of make something realized. That's a very kind of hippy dippy kind of idea, right? But it basically turns the idea into that kind of actualization. And so the presentation of stories is important, especially in the 21st century, because the markets are always really crowded, right? Businesses, there's a lot of businesses, a lot of startups, that kind of stuff. So the idea, by having your story kind of really nailed down and thinking about, okay, how can I then, kind of present it to an audience, is really important, because that initial first impression is what will really kind of pull someone in and, kind of give that hook, right? So after that 2-minute video, of IndoJava, I want to go there, right? It gives you that kind of little hook into a store that you might have just kind of walked past, on any other given day. So that's why the presentation is really important, because you also have to go where people are going to kind of consume content, right? So if you're talking about Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, directing people to your site, those kinds of things, showing someone on your phone, that you have to kind of be able to have those kinds of presentations, right? So there's a few elements to kind of what makes a good story, right? The idea that it's raw, that it's genuine, it's something that you feel you're very passionate about. But it's also that there's a certain big idea to it. So this is something that's adapted from the museum world, from a museum professional called Beverly Serrell. And the big idea is basically that there's one kind of solid sentence, a kind of summation of what the whole thing was, right? So the story that I shared, the big idea about it was nostalgia, right? This was something that happened when I was a teenager, and it creates that sense of nostalgia. But it's also single-stranded, that stories, a good story doesn't necessarily, it doesn't jump around, right? That it always has a definite beginning, and it has a definite end, right? And that there's a clear path from the one to the next. And one of the most important things, and it's going back to what I was saying a few minutes ago about how do you actually find your story is that it's through guided conversation, and we're going to talk about what that is later on. But again, storytelling doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? Like I would not have, stood up and told that story to an empty room, And, the version of this story that I tell is, reflective of who's, the audience there. So that's where when you're thinking about, what is the story behind your startup? What do you want people to know? That's something that you should develop in interacting with someone, in conversing with someone, because the end goal is that engagement and that kind of community, that idea of working and reaching out to a prospective audience. So the start point, again, going back to the idea of the big idea, the start point should also involve someone else, right? It should involve multiple people. And so what we're going to focus on today is kind of doing a run through of the different ways that you can kind of capture a story and record it, right? So one of the ways that you can record stories is through audio recordings. And this is a photograph. I'm going to kind of focus on the audio portion of it. But this is an excerpt from an interview with Arthur Garabedian, who's a carpenter in Niagara Falls. And he is a member of the Armenian community in the Falls, which has been around since the early 1900s for the most part. It's kind of shrunken a bit. But this is a good example of how, does anyone recognize these stores? They're on 9th Street. It's the church on 9th Street in East Falls, that corner at St. Sarkis. But Arthur shares basically the story behind the doors. If it's gonna, it's gonna do the thing with the, how do I turn off the, no, I don't want to keep I don't need my red mark. Okay.
But I did a lot of the work there at the time and everything else for the church. And but now I can't do that work anymore. Well, a friend of mine, George Bloom, and there's this picture right up there. His sister Alice was dying, and she said, ask Art if he could make new church doors for the front of the church. And so he says, yeah, okay. So I made the doors, and we hung them and everything else. We made it right here in the shop. We hung the doors and everything. And Alice came out of the hospital, and she told her brother George, drive me by the church. So that I can see the doors that Arthur made. And George told me, when she passed by in the car, she started crying. Well, when Alice died, George came to me and said, what do I owe you for the doors there? And I said, George, you owe me $4,000. He says, okay. I said, are you nuts? I said, here's what you're going to pay me. The lumber cost me $400. I'm donating my time, material, the glass, and all that you ever see in the windows of scalloped. My idea of the Armenian cross at that time.
So, stories like that, like even just the audio, and again, we go back to this idea of turning a space into a place, that there's a story behind even a church door, right? There's a story behind the stained glass. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the name Bob Beck, but he's a local guy who does a lot of stained glass for a lot of different churches in the area, including for this church. So that's an example of that kind of like audio recording, using again verbal storytelling.
But I did a lot of the work there at the time.
We're gonna start from that one. Then another way is through photography. So again, this is where I talked about visual storytelling, using a still image to kind of tell a story. How many of you guys are familiar with this building in Youngstown? Cold storage facility. And I can't remember your name.
Nick.
Was it?
Nick.
Nick, yeah. And Nick had his own stories about the facility as well. So what are some of the things you see in this photo that you kind of learn, that you take away from it, right?
That's
yeah, yeah. It's a building that's falling down, historic, right? That there was obviously an incident that happened. With the fence, easy to climb, by the way. Don't on camera. Easy to come on. But you know, and you know, again, that the building's falling apart, but also someone's actually working on documenting it, right? So even looking at that image, the story you're getting is that, and the big idea is that it's important to document these old buildings that are falling apart, right? Because in 100 years, this building might be gone, right? It might be bulldozed. And with it, you know, you would lose all of that kind of cultural knowledge and memories, all of that, you know, physical representation of, you know, the important, you know, agricultural heritage of Niagara County. But even, you know, the switch of the cold storage facility and it, you know, kind of falling out of use is connected to that, right? So even a still image like this, you can communicate certain ideas, right? Through kind of a curated shot, right? So this is, later on we're going to talk about a concept from visual anthropology, but the idea of, again, documenting a scene rather than a specific, you know, rather than a specific individual, right? So this isn't a photograph of my friend, you know, Jake. It's a photograph of, you know, the actual event that's going on here. And then, you know, another example of it is through videography. So I'm going to use the mouse for this one so we don't have another. So this is an example of a video we produced with a local Japanese calligrapher.
Nakami. Nakami, which means like you're done with this work. When you write characters, kanji, hiragana, anything neatly, like you feel better. Like a space between strokes, also space between characters is very important. It's the same as flower arrangement, ikebana. So many people want to put many flowers in the vase, but it's not correct. You sometimes have some space between flowers and then the vase. That's an important thing. So ink amount, space, strokes, stuff like how you push the brush against the paper, also how you release the brush and the ink amount. So like you have to control those things by yourself to make your satisfying work. It's kind of, there is no other same thing. So this is only one in the world, right? So that is the most important thing to me, also very precious thing. Yeah. So this is the only one.
Because I think that's your signature on the wall.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
What was
The
it?
stamp.
It's your signature on the wall. Oh.
Yep. Yeah, the red stamps you see are the I forgot the name for it. The use seal characters, but that's when she was saying at the beginning, not I mean when it's done. That's the stamps. So every calligrapher has their own like arrangement of characters on it. So that's a you know, example of a video. So you know, and that's where, you know, it's really important to do this kind of soul searching and these like field work and this kind of curating focus, because, you know, for her, you know, what makes that tradition important for her is the idea that the thing she's creating is going to be the only one of it, right? So it's not necessarily that connection to, you know, necessarily like the Japanese culture or those kind of things. Like for her personally, it's that idea that, you know, it is this traditional art, but what makes it meaningful for her and what she wants other people to know is that the thing that she's making and that they see is the only version of that that's ever going to exist.
It seems also true of the photograph you show of the cold storage building.
Mm-hmm.
The intern,
Sorry. Yes.
the intern Jake is in the foreground. He's important,
Mm-hmm.
and it seems to me it's not just a photograph of the building, but of somebody documenting
Mm-hmm.
the building itself. You want to show
Yep.
someone in the act of doing the historical work that's going to preserve it.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's exactly it, and that's where, you know, when we talk about the idea of visual anthropology and documenting a scene, and also, you know, I've taken thousands of photographs, you know, in the 6 years I've been here, but tonight I chose this one, right? So that's where it's that curating one, and you exactly hit on it. You know, that it's talking about these ideas of documentation, things that are old, you know, that maybe, you know, should be preserved before they're forgotten. Yeah.
Well, what else I see is that it's perspective lines, and he's in a diminutive position, yet he's trying to do something that saves the entire image.
That's a really neat takeaway. Yeah, I haven't thought of it that way, but it is neat. Yeah, it's a very large building, and this kind of cuts off the you know, there's the whole other end of it, you know.
But the fact that he's in a crouched position, he's humbling himself before the building in respect, sort of thing, like a Japanese.
Yeah, that's really neat.
But it reinforces by what you had just seen. Might not have been thinking that way had you not also seen the calligraphy.
And so that's part of, again, where we talk about storytelling as this tool for connecting between individuals. So again, you know, you're kind of having your own takeaways that are, you know, then kind of circulating in this particular moment. But then the next time you go see that building or you see another old building, it's going to, again, it's going to fester. It's going to create that kind of, those kinds of emotions and ideas, right?
Well, if in fact your emotional takeaway is that it's an old building, that somebody is, in fact, trying to put in context.
Mm-hmm. That's another
And
good
if you
takeaway.
just saw it as just another building on the street, then you might not have the same reaction as seeing another old building on the street.
Right, exactly, yeah. That it can depend on, your particular interaction with it. And again, that's where that sense of place, you know, the moving from a space into a place becomes a big thing. And so technical equipment is really interesting as well. And what we're gonna focus on is, you know, what do you really need to kind of record and capture your story? If you guys saw the calligraphy video, what do you think we used to document that? You know, the actual making of the calligraphy.
iPhone?
Yes, you got it. So smartphone. So that's where, you know, one of the things I want, you know, everyone to kind of leave with today is the idea that you don't need to be complex to be effective, right? You can be basic, and it can also have the same thing, right? Because it also depends on how people are interacting with it, right? So like, if people are interacting with a video like that on a screen like this size or on a phone, that's, you know, fine to use like a video like that. You know, if we were to put it in like the Regal Cinemas or something, you know, it would be pixelated, you know. So that's one of the things to really think about with considerations in terms of what kind of equipment you might need and might want to use for thinking about, okay, I have my story, how, you know, what's the next step? Like, what am I going to capture with it? Is think about where do you want it to go? Like, how do you want other people to interact with that story? Do you want, you know, people to interact with it through like a website? Do they want people to interact with it through a channel, through social media, through that kind of stuff? And that's where you really need to kind of envision people interacting with it. And again, you know, the idea that, you know, thinking about, okay, how complex do I need to go to get my message across? Then you need to think about dynamic and static presentations as well. And by dynamic, I mean moving image, right? I mean video, right? Because in, you know, nowadays, you know, that's like the big thing, is, you know, having that kind of video presentation like you saw in the first example or in the calligraphy example, right? That's really dynamic because it gives you that sense of like a living environment, right? Where still image is a bit more, there's a little bit of a barrier there, right? Or with the audio, sometimes mixed with still image, you could kind of sometimes get close to it, but audio is also considered static. One of the other big things to kind of consider is thinking about kind of blending candid action and staged recordings. And by staged recordings or photography, I mean those kind of curated moments, right? So like when I go out and I interview again, we've been doing this video docu-series about the Armenian community in Niagara Falls, you know, and I'm documenting you know, this family that makes choreg, which is like this type of traditional Armenian Easter bread. You know, I document the actual making process, so that's like kind of the action and the candid sides. But then separately, you know, we will sit down and do a staged interview, right? Because I like to do it that way because then you can really kind of combine them and overlap them that way. But again, that's getting like a bit more complex because what we're looking for when we create them is long, not the short form videos necessarily, like the 2-minute videos, for the 5 to 10 minutes is what we're looking for, right? So we're kind of looking for that longer stretch. But so with audio recording, you know, if you're thinking, okay, I want people to hear my voice, right? I want people, like, let's say they land on your, you know, on your Facebook page or, you know, on Instagram or on your website, because there's a lot of plugins and that kind of stuff. You might just think about, okay, basic equipment, you know, might just be the smartphone apps you have. Like, and these are just 2 examples of the ones that are built in, right? So if you're on Android, you have Recorder just built into your phone. iOS, it'll be voice memos. If you're looking to record like direct on a computer, kind of like what's going on tonight, you know, maybe you would just hook up a microphone you have. Maybe you got, you know, the the little the headphones that have the little mic set in it as well. Then you can also get like a bit more complex. I actually don't know where I put it. An example, like a digital audio recorder, like over in that kind of corner behind the banner, right? So those are basically like those old tape recorders, but they record in high, definition audio, basically. Could be external microphones. So those are like the microphones you see people hold when they do presentations. Those are like the XLRs or the lapel ones. And you can even think about like sound mixers, right? So again, it's this idea that you can grow as complex as you need, but you don't always need to, right? Again, like that's depending on what you're using it for, and depending on the conditions around it, you don't always need to go so complex. And then you think about, okay, I've recorded my story, my audio story, what do I do next? You have basic software. These are some examples of the different types of software that you can look for. Audacity is a free open source one. It's pretty basic. You have other programs like Reaper. It's got a 3-month free trial, which is pretty cool. GarageBand is kind of the iOS equivalent. Then you can start getting into DAWs, which are digital audio workstations. So these are like if anyone does like music producing, like with MIDI keyboard or any of that kind of stuff, you'll often be using things like Ableton Live or maybe Logic Pro, those kind of more in-depth audio editing and production. Or Adobe Audition is another example. Photography. So again, going back to that idea of all the kind of takeaways that we had from just looking at that image of the cold storage building, that one we took on a camera because the lighting and I had my camera with me. But basic, you can even just use your smartphone. I'll caveat that if it's a smartphone like within the last 5 years, right? Like my phone's about I think 5-6 years, and its camera's still holding up pretty well. If it's older than that period, the smartphone cameras you might end up in like a lot of pixelated, kind of image or trouble focusing and that kind of stuff. But then you can also move into, more complex stuff like proper DSLR cameras, right? Canon example, Nikon, or a mirrorless, right? So that's like what I use here. And again, this is, kind of getting a bit more complex, but like this is my kind of go-to when I do photography. Then when you're thinking about, okay, I've taken my photos, I've selected a few good ones, and we'll look at methodology at the end. These are some basic software. Again, you don't always need to get complex. Sometimes even work at the museum, like even though I'll have access to like Affinity Photo or Adobe Photoshop or those kinds of things, sometimes, Windows Photo is all you need. Like you just sometimes will need like the basics. Microsoft Paint, it's got a great resizing tool in it. The photos editor on iOS and macOS is good too. So again, it's really thinking about, how, what's your skill level at when you're doing this, and again, what do you need to do to kind of get your photo how you're looking that you want it. And so video recording, basic equipment, again, smartphones, again, more recent ones, we'll say again within the last 5 years. Cameras, that'll be more of like, not these types of professional cameras, but the more like kind of point and click, like the Nikon Coolpix and those kinds of ones. And also your computer, right? And then again, complex, you can start to go back into your cameras. A lot of, videographers will use the same cameras that they use for photography for videography as well. But then, the next step up from that, which is, even a step of complexity beyond what I use, is professional camcorders, which can go like $1,500 at the cheapest, just for the camcorder. But if you use one of those, then you're also looking at needing these kind of camera mount microphones, like this guy here. And then when you're looking at video production too, again, you're thinking about how basic and how complex you need to be. So your basic software for video editing is what we call linear editors. So these linear, they're edits you make on a line. It's basically you have one track, and that's kind of what you work with. So iMovie video editor, Windows Movie Maker if you have an older version of Windows, that's what they use. The complex software, these are what we call nonlinear editors. So these are where I liken it to playing with Lego blocks, basically, right? Because you might have 5-6 tracks of video that you can all, kind of arrange in blocks and kind of cut and move, and it can take a long time to kind of get to that stage. But there's free programs like DaVinci Resolve, which is also used in Hollywood, but they use the paid version. Adobe Premiere, Final Cut, and the nonlinear editors are great where, like I mentioned, I take a lot of candid shots and stage shots separate. And that's where, I use the nonlinear editors because it helps kind of with the transitions between them a lot easier. And then we think about, okay, how do I actually go about putting forward that story, right, that I've recorded, whether it's through audio, whether it's a photo that I've taken, or if it's through a video. And so you might look at, where you're going to host it. If you're doing audio, you can host it on SoundCloud for free. I think it's up to 3 hours possibly on SoundCloud. Video, Vimeo or YouTube, right? And this is kind of the big divide, right? YouTube's a lot better for searching internally on YouTube, but you also always got ads and stuff nowadays. Vimeo's great for if you're looking for embedding stuff, but it's a bit harder to kind of navigate within Vimeo itself. Embedding in use, what kind of platforms do you engage with people, right? If you're looking at Instagram, that's where you're really, if you're looking to, let people know about your startup on Instagram, that's where you're really going to be kind of staying in that kind of basic category because it has to stay, it's mobile only editing and uploading, right? Facebook actually used to have a great feature on its the cover pages where you could actually loop short form videos on Facebook, right? But they kind of got rid of that in 2021. So hopefully that'll return. Maybe you have a website, right? Most website, platforms, whether it's Wix, WordPress, Weebly, Squarespace, those are also things that, they all have different kind of embedding abilities kind of like built into it, right? So if you have a website, it's pretty easy to embed video or whatever kind of content you've kind of created to help share your story.
What kind of value do you think SoundCloud provides?
On its own, not a lot. This is where it's really, focused on if you have a website already. That, it's really just basically to provide like a URL that you can then link and embed. On its own, SoundCloud's pretty tough to crack because there is like a massive amount of, stuff on SoundCloud, so it's very hard to kind of search sometimes for things on it.
What do you think would be a good host? What would you host on a SoundCloud?
Oh, well, so this would be like if you have, like, let's say you record like a minute kind of like talking about, the history of your startup, that kind of stuff and all your ideas, then you would load it to SoundCloud and then from SoundCloud get the URL and then embed it onto like your, website that you use. Or again, if you want to go into a linear editor, you can put that audio with a still image clip and have the audio playing over, export it as a video. And then you have kind of a video. But again, so that's kind of like the mixing of the audio and the photography, which is okay, but it's a bit different from kind of a full kind of video. All right, so we think about methodology. So with storytelling, it's really important and in being a folklorist for about, how long? Probably about 8 years at this point, 6 years at the Castellani. Minimizing distractions and ambient noise is really important when you are doing research, but it's also very difficult, right? But so when you're thinking about, okay, I want to record a story, recommendation would be to not go to the loudest place, right? It's also like if you got a TV in the background, turn the TV off. If you got, your phone with you, turn your phone off. Because it's, it's really important to kind of minimize any kind of ambient noise in the background when you're recording audio, because those things are very annoying to kind of take out of audio that you're going to use. It's also important with photos, right? If you're curating a very carefully staged shot, everything's set up really nice, you don't want to get photobombed by like your cat, right? Or your dog kind of like walking in. With a video, kind of the same thing, right? You want to make sure if you're taking this video that it's capturing what you want to take and not capturing ambient noise, right? So one example of how difficult that can be is like with that interview with Art Garabedian, whose carpentry shop just on Portage Road, Art's wood shop, that they had a space heater, I think it was a propane heater, that's one that like blasts the hot air, right? And that kicked on, like kind of halfway through the interview. So there's kind of like a 5-minute stretch, where eventually we were like, oh, it's, kind of really picking up that. But there's a 5-minute stretch in that audio where we can't use that in the thing that we want to create for Art, the short video about Art, because of that ambient noise in the background. Because all you hear is, like a really loud kind of like blasting noise behind his voice, which is very distracting. And again, you know, one of the most important things is to identify a conversation partner or someone that can, you know, kind of be with you on that storytelling kind of journey, and that you can kind of talk about your startup and kind of talk about, you know, all of your, you know, kind of ideas, your origins, and we're going to get into that next. Develop discussion topics and questions with conversation partner. We'll see that next. The big thing is when you think about that is to reflect, but don't memorize your responses. Because it goes back to that idea that a good story is raw. You know, it's not rehearsed. Like, you can tell when someone's kind of memorized, you know, their pitch, or, you know, they've memorized like everything word for word, right? So memorizing something word for word, you know, it can sometimes feel like not genuine, right? It can feel like someone's not connecting with you as you and them, right? That there's kind of this like, you know, script that you're being fed. So a good story is something that doesn't seem like it's off a script. So one of the tricks for that is reflecting and focusing on topics rather than answers, right? And then to assemble and kind of curate a scene. And this is especially important with photos and videos, right? So if you are, let's say you're involved in the food business, you know, I think a local restaurant that does a great job on social media and content creation's Gotta Have It, which just opened in the falls, right? They do a great job of, you know, showing some of the Palestinian kind of, you know, like backgrounds and food traditions. One of their videos, it's like a short video, 30-second one. It's got like 5 million views now. It's really kind of blown up. And what's interesting is because it's a very specific scene that it's capturing, you know, it's capturing this kind of moment of flipping over a grape leaf, you know, grape leaves they're cooking in a pot upside down. So that's really like, if you're thinking about, okay, you know, if I work in a food district, maybe I'm going to show like a particular dish and kind of really get it, like really nail to get all the angles really nicely. If you work, like, let's say in like contracting or construction, it's again thinking about, okay, what's the scene you want? You want a scene of everyone kind of laying down on the job, or you want a scene like people kind of working and you know, kind of working on different things. So that's where curating the scene is really important. So when you're thinking about, you know, again, coming up with the audio portion, so coming up with the actual idea for a story and working with someone else, is to start thinking about it from a place of questions, right, and kind of discussion topics. And so there's a difference between good questions and bad questions, right? So bad questions are closed ended, which means that they are basically yes or no, that there's no opportunity to expand on that question, right? So it doesn't spark discussion, right? So if someone asks, you know, do you enjoy what you do? That's kind of like a yes or no question, right? Like, it's kind of like yes or no. You know, do you like pizza? You know, yes or no. So those are not good questions, right? Those are examples of bad questions. Bad questions, they can also lead or assume an answer, right? So when you're thinking about, you know, like, do you like Hawaiian pizza, which is the most, you know, disgusting kind of pizza out there? You know, that's kind of like an example of like a leading question, right? Because you're kind of assuming that you know what the answer is going to be. So good questions, they're open-ended, they can spark discussion, you know, they encourage reflection, they don't lead or assume an answer, and they don't overly rely on previous experience. So an example of some discussion topics to kind of get you guys started and kind of thinking about it is to think about questions like, you know, tell me about your startup. So again, this is where, you know, imagine that you're sitting across from someone and you give them these lists of questions and they ask you that question, tell me about your startup, right? Or they ask you, guide us through a typical day for your, again, if you're in a restaurant, right? If you work in, you know, trash disposal, you know, guide us through a typical day as a trash disposal person, right? Walk us through how you create something, right? So if you're an artist, you know, kind of walk us through that process. You know, you can think about questions like, what was it like starting out? You know, what have you found challenging? You know, what have you found exciting, right? Those kinds of questions. From a technical standpoint, you know, thinking about the kinds of gear, again, going back to that whole kind of capturing your story and your idea, is I cannot stress enough how important triple checking gear is. And, you know, again, I've been doing it for 8 years, I still forget it often. You know, nothing's more, you know, kind of deflating than actually getting everything all ready and then finding out, oh, I forgot to charge my camera, you know, or I forgot to, you know, put new batteries in my recorder. So it's always important to do that. Test run and practice. There was also an interview I did where I plugged the mic in backwards. This was about 2 years into being a folklorist, and I had done video interviews before, but I plugged the mic in backwards. So I got an hour of someone creating, this really neat illuminated manuscript with no audio and no way to kind of get that audio back because I plugged things in backwards. So that's why it's always important to do a little test run before you do. And like today before we started, that's what we focused on. It's kind of getting audio levels and that kind of stuff. Think about capturing, a mix of candid shot and also stage shot. So again, one of the big things, and it's in the tips later, is to always take more than you think you need. So again, that one photograph of the cold storage facility is 1 out of 100 that I took that day, right? Because, no, not 100. I think it was 50 I took that day. But take it from all different angles because you don't know like what you're going to end up using for what, right? Or when you go back and reflect, you don't really know what's going to kind of come out the best. Capturing, stage scene and audio. So again, if you're thinking especially of, recording an audio portion, again, minimizing distractions, making sure that, there's not going to be like a fire alarm going on in the background if it can be helpful. And then exploring some of the different platforms that you might want to kind of engage with audience on. Again, if you work on social media and you find a lot of your audience that you want to engage with is on social media, then it's maybe thinking about, okay, if a lot of them are on Instagram, then maybe we're going to, again, stay basic. We're going to stay with using our smartphone. Presentation methodology, this is really important, thinking about how, the video composition. So thinking about, okay, we have the one big idea behind the story, what video footage tells that, right? So with that smallest, restaurant in New York City that you saw, the smallest kitchen, it would be weird if they didn't include a look at the kitchen, right? Like if the video is focused on the smallest kitchen and focused on this passion, all this kind of stuff, if it didn't show any of that, it only showed the retail side, it wouldn't be communicating that big idea, and it wouldn't be communicating that. And again, we all kind of saw all the different kind of takeaways you could have in just a 2-minute short video. And again, if you're doing an audio only one, you'd also want to keep it at that kind of 1 to 2 minute video. So again, photography style, we're thinking about visual anthropology, so we're thinking about the idea of documenting an entire scene rather than an individual thing being made, right? So this is like a concept where if you are, let's say that you're interviewing a woodcarver, you're photographing a woodcarver, you don't focus only on their hands, right? You want also a photo of where they're working, right? You want a wider photo of what they're actually making. You want to see what they're wearing. You want to see what kind of things are in the background. Is there a speaker on the table, right? So when you think about staging a photo or doing some kind of photography or kind of still image storytelling, think about that. Think about it from that picture of like a big scene, the wider scene rather. And again, you had mentioned about bringing, using audio, and you can again use it with still image if you wanted. You can use iMovies or even like the Windows Video or Movie Maker to basically put the audio over one still image throughout the whole period. One of the big things too, depending on how people interact with it, is including that kind of, not metadata is a strong word, but captions, that kind of supplemental information that people, want to know, that kind of help communicate that big idea, right? So even if you're posting a photo or a video on Instagram, what's the text information that's going to go along with it, right? And this is where it's important to think about it from an interpretive standpoint and a big idea standpoint, rather than just saying, this video is about X, Y, and Z. It could be, about, it would be more interpretive, it would be more kind of like painting a picture rather than explaining what the video is about. And then, you brought up some questions about hosting and embedding, right? So it's thinking about where will be a site that you can host stuff for free, and depending on, like, again, what kind of size needs you have, and then where it's going to be used, right? If you're going to embed it onto a website or use it across your social media platforms, do you need to host it through a third party, or can you do it direct, like through Instagram, as an example? So some additional resources that are great for like a inspiration, mostly on YouTube. Great Big Story is an example of the one that was in the first video. And they have a very broad focus. A lot of it's focused on short form videos. And again, it's very much focused on that intersection between storytelling and content creation, right? So it's about telling the story about these different, one of my other favorite ones is about a family in Iran that still make rose water, and they document and show like how rose water is made. And so again, that intersection of storytelling and short form videos. Insider's another great one, another great series, and there's a lot of sub-series like Business Insider, Art Insider. I'm trying to think, there's another Insider, but I can't remember what the other one is. But so they give like kind of a behind the scenes. So if you remember, one of the questions and one of the discussion topic suggestions for the storytelling methodology, walk us through a typical day of X, Y, and Z. That's basically what the whole Insider series is structured as. All of them are basically structured as, this is what it's like to be, a New York City garbage bin, during the day. And Eater's kind of the same way as well, that they all focus on that kind of behind the scenes, typical day of, such and such place. Brute is another good one that has a broad focus, short form videos, focused on that kind of storytelling, a little bit more staged than Great Big Story in the sense that, the individual usually introduces the story as well, and then they kind of jump into it as well. So one of the big things when you're thinking about storytelling and kind of moving on from here is when you identify a partner, it's really important to have rapport, right? That to have that relation with the person that you're thinking of sitting with you and kind of helping you kind of develop your story and develop your ideas, right? Because that rapport is really critical to coming up with those really kind of important and kind of powerful kind of touch points and those those really meaningful parts of your story and what you're interested in. It's really important to have rapport with a person, right? And then think about, okay, again, thinking back to your storytelling is really to try and nail down, like, what do you want someone else to know about what you do, right? So for myself as a curator of folk arts, those 4 pillars I mentioned, that is, the story of the folk arts program at the Gaston Art Museum, That's what I want people to know, is that we have these 4 dimensions, We're not just making exhibits, right? We're doing all of these, we're doing field work, doing programs, doing initiatives. So that's when you're thinking about the story that you're trying to develop, to really have that kind of out-of-body experience almost, to really kind of think what you want other people to know. For a technical standpoint, you want to focus on taking more footage than you need always. So it might be taking multiple takes. Once you have your story nailed down and you decide to record the audio of it, take multiple recordings of those kind of conversations. That's really important, because you might hear something like, oh, I really like how I kind of emphasize such and such, or I described it in option B this way, and then option F, I described it this way, and I like that one more, so we're going to use that version of it, right? So always take more than you need. Usually we say like about 5 times more than you actually need or are going to use. And then you can look to co-working spaces or incubators like Trek or Niagara Falls Library if you need equipment access, support, computer access, that kind of stuff. Again, we think about methodology and where it's really important with the discussion topics and just from a presentation standpoint. And again, that idea that a good story is something that's raw and it's genuine, that it's good to reflect on discussion topics, but it's not good to memorize answers, right? So it's good to reflect on questions that are going to be asked, but you don't want to memorize answers, right? Because again, the whole idea is that storytelling is something that comes out of this organic kind of interactive, kind of process. So you want to always leave that open. We're not robots. We're going to describe things differently each time we, tell a story or we talk about something. We're going to always describe it differently. So leaving it open by reflecting rather than memorizing an answer is really important to developing your story. The separate recording of action shots and audio interview portions, again, that's more focused on kind of the video side. And then, from the other methodology, to always practice. I've learned a lot of what I did as a folklorist through, some of it was through education, but literally like the field school I went to was basically, driving us to this Upward community in Newfoundland and kind of here you go, here you guys, you got the equipment, go learn how to use it, right? And that's what I always feel is the most effective way to learn things is practice, right? But guided practice, again. Because online instruction, YouTube tutorials, those things are always really important as well. So, just some next steps closing before we kind of open up to discussion period. Is to really think about, your origin, your purpose, and future for what you are trying to create. Think about, what you're trying to start, where you are now, why you, started it, and then where you want to go. Think about what kind of platforms of audience engagement you have. Are you on social media? Are you more on Instagram than on Facebook? Are the people you want to reach more on Instagram or on Facebook? Are they mostly, consuming, websites directly? So maybe you focus more on the website side of it. And then practice. That's always the big thing. Practice just recording memos to yourself. Familiarize yourself with the different kind of tools that you already have available to you, and always start basic. Always start. It's always good to start small and then kind of grow out farther from there. So just some closing thoughts. It's really, storytelling is really important for, businesses, I think, and startups, because it does provide that kind of firm contact. It provides this really kind of deep connection between yourself, your organization, your startup, and the audience that you are, kind of inviting to engage with you, right? It provides that specific moment of interaction. And effective storytelling can be done through dynamic, which might be a mixed audio and video, or static. So again, photos, content creation, that kind of stuff, right? So photos, we saw even the image of the cold storage facility, that there was a lot of takeaway from that. There's a lot of different kind of takeaways from that. So even, if you're thinking, well, I can't, do audio, or I'm not comfortable doing video, they're even just thinking and kind of curating, okay, but I can take a photograph, right? I know how to use my smartphone camera, and I know what I'm passionate about. How can I use, blend those two together and kind of curate an image? And just, finally, everyone really is a story worth sharing, and every startup has a story worth sharing, and, we all have these things, but we don't always share them. And, that's what I'm really passionate about. And again, going back to the example of just the church doors that, probably people have driven past, for a while, and I think Shaniqua, you mentioned that you've gone past it for a while, knowing that there's a story there, right? That there's a reason that those doors look the way they do, and there's a reason that that person made it, right? And, this is kind of a memorial kind of situation. And I think because everyone has a story worth sharing, we're all, as humans, the better for hearing them. So, I thought maybe you open up the floor. Is there any questions or?
So, just come back one more slide, because I just want to reference it. The overarching question comes to my mind. We're talking here, everyone has a story worth sharing. It's the big question that comes to my mind is, how do you identify which story it is?
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm looking at this and I'm thinking from a business perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I can fully appreciate this from a folklore perspective.
Right.
But from a business perspective, how do I get a return on investment? How do I get a decent return on investment of the time it's going to take for me to put together this story,
Mm-hmm.
so that not only does it work from a visual perspective or from a presentation perspective, but it's actually returning something back to my business because I've documented the story, made it available.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that goes a lot into kind of that, balancing on the amount of work that you're going to put into something and kind of making sure that you get back out of it, right?
It would seem to me, and again, I studied folklore when I was in undergraduate school a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
A long time ago. And so I can appreciate that the advantage that you have from a folklore perspective is the opportunity to get a huge amount of content and then curate it.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm as a businessman, if I spend a lot of time creating content and curating it, I put myself out of business because I'm not doing what my business needs to do or earn income. So I'm trying to balance the two. I don't know if you have any insight into it.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, again, we'll go back to the kind of return on investment. It's one of those things that's very hard to kind of monetize and kind of like gauge, like how much is this, like actually, sort of like I mentioned, like they gotta have it, when the videos kind of blew up, how
Well, let me
many.
use that for an example.
Yeah.
It blew up, it got a lot of hits. What did it do for the business?
Exactly. Yes, that's what I was gonna get to. Yeah, like did it translate to buys? And that's one of those things where it's very hard to understand. To kind of track and monetize that, right?
But what kind of business?
If I'm a business
You're right.
and I'm going to enter into this event, it's going to be with the objective of generating more business.
Mm-hmm.
And if I get a lot of goodwill by getting my content out, doesn't generate the business, it's all well and good, but it doesn't,
Well,
allow me to pay my employees.
Yeah, well, I think, one way to think about it is, the difference between an engaged audience and a prospective audience, right? So it's part of the idea between storytelling and content creation, that kind of stuff, is to provide that kind of firm contact that can, turn someone who, maybe, sees you on a scroll and just kind of scrolls past, or, sees, oh, this is something, I'm going to click on it, I'm going to engage with it further, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it almost like provides like another touch point. But again, it's hard to kind of track those kind of things monetarily.
Casio brought that, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but again, it's a return on it.
I've had to struggle with that problem through doing public outreach, which is similar and even more ephemeral. You're out in the public doing an activity and how you engage, putting staff out there, the materials, etc. We build in a discount, so at the end of the video, maybe it's mention you saw this video for 10% off, or mention the code word X, and then you see how many people come into your business and mention it, and then you do have a measurable, people spending money.
It's a great point.
Yeah.
It's the age old between sales and marketing, right? As a lifelong marketing person, everybody says, well, what's the return on investment? But the impressions forgot to have it. What that video did was, the local news stations that searched the local media and searched social media found it. WGRZ did a full story on it, and the number of impressions, which is what marketers talk about now when they're trying to get together on they're trying to have national standards on what's a benchmark for marketing and return on investment, and they're still talking about it, and it's still, but then the answer is, okay, I can prove to you that I've invested this much. These are the impressions. This is the potential audience that I've hit. And if just 2% of that audience acts on that impression, then I can prove the return on investment. And
It makes great sense from the marketer's perspective to pitch it to the business.
Yeah.
But as you are both the marketer, the production worker, the finance person, because you're the business owner,
Yeah.
you're sitting there, you're looking at it, and you're saying, this is great. What I want to know is, you can point out, just using an example, it can be documented how many impressions, how many hits this video had. This general goodwill, because it obviously had spillover effect. It moved outside of the original media. My question is, what did it do to your business? The person that can answer this is the person in the business.
Can't you develop some kind of metric or survey when someone comes in or buys something for takeout? How did you find out about this?
I agree.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that as a business owner with limited resources, do I invest in this?
Right. Yeah.
Do I throw out the net, hope that I catch fish, or do I go with a fish hook?
And that's where it's also, like gauging, well, how much time are you going to invest in it? So that might be where it's like, well, maybe a still image is all I can
Right. So I guess the
Yeah.
question that comes to my mind, and I'm not saying we should have the answer here, but it's the question that comes to my mind is, how do I determine what the best story I should be sharing is? How do I determine what the best content is to put into my story? Because ultimately, I may only get the chance to present one story.
That's
At
job
a
for
time,
creative.
yeah.
It's a creative job.
Yeah. So I'll just follow up with that. Yeah, I mean, there are multiple stories behind everything, right? So it is.
Somebody doesn't want to necessarily hear the second story. That's the point. It's the second story that can actually generate business.
Well, so this.
How do I make the,
Right. Well, so this is where some of it is like to see what sticks, right? To see what kind of connects with people. But that's also where again the whole idea is that you're developing these stories in conversation with someone else, right? That you are developing this idea. So as you kind of develop it, you're also reflecting on, okay, this is what I feel passionate about, and if the person you're working with also kind of connects with that too, then you're like, this is a really good touch point, right? This is a really good thing that your prospective audience might be able to to turn into an actual engaged audience. But
It would seem to me that you would want to first, before entering into the process, determine what your strategic objective beyond, from the creation of the story and publishing of the story would be. And I'm just wondering if that's something that you have any insight into. And again, I recognize it from a folklore perspective. You go to you go to New Brunswick, you go to Nova Scotia, you start meeting people, you start capturing stories. From that, you determine where the truly compelling stories are.
right,
If you're a business, you can't go out there and say, I'll make 150 products and see which one sticks to the wall.
right,
You
yeah.
can talk to
Well,
other
that's-
customers that are coming into your business, right, and say, which of these are you most interested in? And do that a few times a day.
But they're already your customers.
But at least you have a sample.
But I'm saying, just you're asking your existing customers, what do you do business with me now? What do I do to keep your business, or what do I do to expand your business? What about all those other people that you want to become your customer? And again, I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
Yeah, no, it's all right.
That's
Yeah.
what brings the
Well,
thing.
Imperial,
Yeah.
to point out investment in resources to produce something that will bring in customers. The best storytellers, supposedly, the ones that have the most money, are the Super Bowl commercial producers. But yet, I watched for 15 seconds a QR code float across the screen. Well, it still cost everybody the same amount of money to advertise the same amount of time, but he had no production cost, basically.
I actually read an article about that commercial, and the reason that they did that is because they could capture the metrics. So they actually could check the conversion rates on that, off of those QR codes that were up on the screen.
Yeah, so it's not a storytelling activity, it's a marketing activity. It's a market investigation activity.
And yet the whole Super Bowl commercials is supposed to be about storytelling, and yet they bypassed it for the end point.
Yeah, I didn't watch the Super Bowl because I don't have live TV, I mean, storytelling again, it's something that is involved in content creation. It's present in marketing, it's present in films, present in everything that all those faces that you put forward for your business. So
Yeah.
Are you using social media at all currently?
No.
So before we go any further, I wanted to really thank you for this presentation, and I think we all owe you a bit of applause.
Yeah,
Kind of a long question, so bear with me. I'll try to shorten it. But Stephen Colbert last night was joking about that there's pictures of the war in Russia, or the Russian, the front in Ukraine on TikTok. And he sort of went, and I don't know anything about TikTok because I'm 57 and I can't relate to it. And then he tried to do a little dance. And if you see the clip, it's funny, but what I've seen is statistics now, looking, in one of the Hootsuite newsletters, whatever it is, it's like 70% of marketing spend now is going to be shifted towards TikTok. And the way that storytelling for me, for my whole life in producing videos for customers, for reaching out, for trying to find multipliers, for trying to find metrics, all of those things, stories are about emotions, and that's sort of what you're talking about. The firm point of contact is the emotional, is in we should say in PR is rational and emotional, right? You make a decision to buy a car based on the safety features and the rational, logical things you can do, but you also love the way you look in that car, right? And it's the emotional. And
Love The Sopranos.
Right, that's fundamental to storytelling.
Great as Sopranos from my hometown.
No, but I make that point because it was a commercial that the entire hook was the fact that it was the next generation of The Sopranos cast in the commercial. That was the whole hook.
Yeah, and so it's the emotion that you're watching Sopranos, whatever it is that it means to you, and so there are different emotional touch points in each video and each picture. The picture in Youngstown means so much more to me. It's the house that's in the background is my friends. I grew up with it, and so it means different things to different people, and it's hitting those emotions. And so what's happening is, and the reason why emotions are so connected is because our limbic system, our emotional system, is developed for thousands and tens of hundreds of thousands of years as human beings. long before language and long before, but the logical stuff came much later. The frontal cortex stuff comes much later. So the way that we tell stories was always about emotion. And so TikTok and dumbing it down into 10 seconds, and so I wanted to get your take on the trend to kind of compact the story more and more. You talked about Facebook and YouTube channels and short story form, but it's getting shorter and shorter and shorter to the point where are we losing the emotion, and how to, as a company, how do you decide, like, do I want to make a short form video to tell my story about my restaurant, or do I want to make a TikTok video now because that's what everybody's telling me? I better make a 10-second TikTok video. And so where can you maintain the firm point of contact for audiences?
So TikTok is really good. I mean, that's pretty new, and it's basically like mini form, videos, like a mini 10-second form. In a situation like that, with using a platform, a lot of it is also what's your prospective audience, right? So you mentioned like The Sopranos. It's like, so the people watching that, probably like maybe millennials or kind of older, got like the reference and got all the, like the people. But I remember seeing online a lot of people are like, who are these people?
But
Like,
again, you have to look at what the product is and what they're trying to sell.
Well,
They're trying to sell a $70,000 truck.
Well, yeah, so but yeah, I think it was the electric one, right?
Yeah.
So that's part of, again, tapping into that idea that maybe there's millennials out there that have money, that have 70,000. But so with the TikTok, a lot of that situation is thinking about, okay, target audience, like, is your audience on TikTok? Like, are you looking at millennials, Gen Z, that kind of stuff? And in those situations, it is hard to distill things down into a 10-second video, and it gets complicated, but in those situations, it could also be a quantity kind of idea, like taking a lot of, 10-second videos, and then it tells it across, tells a little bit of it in each. But
each time.
Again, 10 seconds is a pretty short one.
Where do you think Twitter fits in all this now?
Twitter's good. That's more from, it kind of, again, I guess kind of like the marketing, kind of like the push forward kind of one. I'm not too familiar. I haven't really thought about like the Twitter kind of aspect of it too much. In terms of like audience engagement, I think Twitter you can embed videos and kind of do that kind of stuff. But when I think about platforms that people are looking to engage with things like visually instead of kind of like text, like kind of focus, will be on like Instagram especially. It's like very popular. But Twitter is very useful. Sometimes you'll see like those kind of text threads are like pretty good for kind of like storytelling in that way. But I haven't thought too much about Twitter honestly. Yeah.
So ultimately, this boils back to the concept of identify your market and understand your market. It'll help you determine all of the points you made about the decisions you have to make.
Yeah. And it is, one of the things we didn't really touch on is also, these kind of exercises they can do, like sitting down with someone and talking like a bit like that. It does also have like an analog or like a real world use too outside of like the digital sphere and the content creation sphere, is that it kind of helps you hone in on like what do you want to like hone in when you go and meet, like let's say you meet like a new investor, like, that this story will really be captivating for them and kind of help them, kind of look at investing in what you're, kind of selling, right? So there is like that practical perspective too, but a lot of this is focused on, okay, you have this story, let's, put it out there, let's figure out a way to share it through digital media. So.
I facilitate a networking group for mid to upper level job seekers. Alan's part of it, Barry and Peter. And we use storytelling every week in some capacity, and it's part of the foundation for how we do what we do. I was thinking as you were talking about Richard Bauman, who's written books on anthropology.
Yeah.
And he says that stories are not only the events that they recount, but the events in which they are told. And so part of the firm point of contact in the emotional dimension that Alan's talking about is the way the story is told is key. And that's not only what it recounts, but how it's conveyed. And that's where the audience comes in. We often emphasize in our group that hiring managers hire people they like. There's an emotional connection there. Granted, they have to be experienced, they have to be qualified, but often that human dimension is a connection that is relayed through the interview. And the anecdotal research we've been able to come up with is that if an interview turns into more of a conversation and an exchange of stories, the more likely the person is to be hired.
That's interesting, and that's yeah, and I think that's a great point you bring up. And you know, the Richard Bauman and Dan Ben Amos is another like folklorist involved with that. The whole field of contextualism, and you know, so for them like storytelling and kind of the meaning that you have or the function that it has. It's not just the meaning embedded in the story itself, but it's the actual action and the context in which it's shared. That's where.
Yeah, I think of his book, Story, Performance, and Event.
Yeah.
It's a performance.
Yeah.
You know, in a good way.
Yeah. Other questions? Well, I'd like to thank everyone for listening to me speak for an hour and a half, and hopefully no one's gotten sick, no one's thrown tomatoes or anything. So
Thank you very much.
I'll hang around here for a bit more. I'll hang around here a bit more if anyone had any further questions.
I want to thank again Ed and for sharing your expertise, your experiences. Thank you for passing on all which of the open partnership. So this is part of our Guide Talk series, third Wednesday of each month. Our next one is coming up March 22nd, called Building Your Personal and Professional Brand. So great for local businesses, entrepreneurs, and also for students. Kim Marie McKernan is going to be leading that discussion at 5:30 on March 22nd. And Ed also mentioned equipment here. So if you ever shoot any footage, we're actually purchasing equipment and software. So if you want to come into Trek and kind of once again practice and play around with the software, with editing your stuff, we're going to have that coming online in the next couple of weeks. Feel free to reach out to us about it. And then last but not least, we are opening a program on April 5th. It's a boot camp for entrepreneurs. It's a 5-week program. If you're a new entrepreneur, existing business, it's a great way for you to kind of revisit your business model, figure out ways you can be more efficient, and we're going to be exploring different topics within a 5-week program. It's 1 day a week, starting April 5th, and the signups for that will be opening up on our website in about 2 weeks. All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.